When you think about how a radical political militia funds its rise to power, your mind probably goes straight to, like, the obvious cinematic stuff.
Right, like the movies.
Exactly. You
Yep.
picture illicit weapons deals in dark alleys or, secretive foreign backers funneling money through shell companies.
Oh, yeah, or maybe some high-stakes bank robberies.
Right. But what if I told you that one of the most notorious paramilitary groups in history actually funded a massive chunk of their violent street campaigns by doing something, well, entirely mundane?
Mundane.
Yeah, they sold cigarettes.
It really does sound like a dark satirical comedy or something, but it is a very real, very unsettling piece of economic and political history.
Yeah, it really is.
It is essentially a story about how everyday consumer habits can be literally weaponized.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the Sturm Cigarette Company. And our source material for this is a really comprehensive Wikipedia article on the subject.
It's quite the read.
It is. And our mission today is to unpack this bizarre, terrifying intersection of, consumer goods, corporate monopolies, and paramilitary funding in 1930s Germany.
Which is just a wild combination.
Truly wild. We're going to explore the actual mechanics of how an armed faction literally built a consumer brand from scratch just to bankroll their ambitions.
Yeah, and before we get into the actual mechanisms of how they, pulled this off, there is an important note we really need to make regarding the nature of this history.
Definitely. Because our source contains politically charged content regarding the Nazi Party and its factions, we want to be clear that we are not taking any sides or endorsing the viewpoints of the content. We are simply reporting impartially on the historical ideas and facts contained in the original source material.
Right. So to really understand how a militia ends up running a tobacco empire, you have to look at the landscape of the 1920s and the Weimar Republic.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So the German tobacco industry at this time was undergoing massive, ruthless changes. A lot of smaller, independent cigarette firms were shutting down.
Getting pushed out.
Exactly. The market was rapidly consolidating. You had a few large, highly automated manufacturers stepping in, buying up the little guys, and just dominating the industry.
Wow.
And the Nazi Party, at this very time, was aggressively attacking these large tobacco firms. They were out there publicly accusing them of having foreign and Jewish connections.
So they're out in the streets publicly railing against these corporate monopolies.
Right.
But here is the massive pivot that we really need to figure out. How does an unfunded paramilitary group, specifically the SA, right, the Sturmabteilung, transition from just complaining about these tobacco monopolies to actually launching a massive, highly structured corporate enterprise of their own?
The short answer: sheer, unadulterated desperation.
Desperation.
Oh, yeah. By 1929, the SA had a major, major cash flow problem. They were expanding rapidly, but they charged no membership fees to join their ranks.
Wait, none at all?
None. So financially, they were entirely dependent on handouts from the Nazi Party leadership.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if the party didn't cut them a check, they literally couldn't operate. They desperately needed an independent income source just to fund their day-to-day operations and, expand their grip on the streets.
Okay, let's unpack this. You have a militia that needs cash, they have zero dues coming in, and they have this massive, growing, restless membership base.
Yep, exactly.
Enter a man named Arthur Dressler. So in 1929, Dressler pitches what is essentially like a venture capital deal to the SA.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Says, let's found a cigarette manufacturer together. The SA members will agree to smoke our cigarettes exclusively, and in return, the SA as an organization gets a royalty.
A very specific royalty, too.
Right, specifically 15 to 20 Pfennig for every 1,000 cigarettes sold.
Yeah.
They actually registered the operation as the Cigarette Fabrik Dressler, but the actual consumer brand they were building was called the Zigarettenfirma Sturm.
And, to put that royalty into perspective, it was about 0.5% of the sales price, considering most of these cigarettes sold at roughly 3 1/3 Pfennig.
Which doesn't sound like much.
No, it sounds like pennies. But in volume, it was exactly the independent revenue stream the SA leadership was hunting for.
It is wildly comparable to what we see today with modern influencer marketing.
Oh, totally.
Think about it. You have a massive internet personality with millions of followers. They launch a snack brand or like a hydration drink to monetize their dedicated audience.
Right, because they know their fans will buy it just to support the brand.
Exactly. Except in this 1929 version, the audience is an armed political militia. The influencer is the SA leadership, And the stakes aren't just, grocery store market share, they're total national dominance.
That is a chilling parallel, honestly. But structurally, it's exactly how the mechanism functioned. They realized they had a captive consumer base.
Yeah.
But having a loyal base and having a functional, mass-producing factory are two very different things.
Right, you need actual machines and facilities.
Exactly. So Dressler approached a Saxon Nazi Party leader, and eventually the SA Chief of Staff Otto Wagner showed interest. But here's the big hurdle. The Nazi Party itself only offered 30,000 Reichsmarks in startup money.
Which, if you were trying to build an automated manufacturing operation to take on national monopolies, it's a complete drop in the bucket. You can't build an empire on 30,000 marks.
Not even close. It actually took a wealthy, independent party supporter named Jacques Bettenhausen stepping in.
Okay, who's that?
He was a businessman who ended up injecting a massive 500,000 Reichsmarks of seed money just to get the factory infrastructure up and running.
500,000.
Yeah, 500,000 marks. That sudden influx of capital was the real catalyst.
So they get this massive seed money and they build the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But creating a product is one thing, right? Actually convincing people to buy your product, especially in an economy completely devastated by the Great Depression that requires a highly calculated strategy.
Oh, absolutely. And their product line was meticulously calculated to reflect the crushing economic reality of the 1930s. They produced 4 main brands.
Right.
You had the premium brand, New Front, which cost 6 Pfennig. Then you had Sturm at 5 and Alarm at 4.
But the real moneymaker, the one that completely took over the market, was their absolute cheapest brand, right? Trommler, or the drummer.
Yep, Trommler.
It cost just 3 1/3 Pfennig. And because the Great Depression had wiped out so much wealth, Trommler was a runaway hit. In 1932, 80% of all their cigarettes sold were Trommler.
And it gets crazier.
Yeah, by 1933, that number skyrocketed to an incredible 95%.
And they backed this cheap product with surprisingly sophisticated traditional marketing. They rolled out sound trucks in the streets. They even hired advertising airplanes to fly over cities.
Wait, hold on. Airplanes. You just said a minute ago that the SA was begging for scraps, relying on party handouts, and couldn't even afford to start a factory. How are they suddenly funding a literal aerial ad campaign?
Well, that is exactly where Jacques Bettenhausen's 500,000 mark seed money came into play.
Ah, right. The seed money.
Exactly. Once they had that initial massive capital injection, they didn't just build the factory. They aggressively scaled their marketing apparatus. They had the budget to operate like a modern corporation.
That makes sense.
In their early print ads, they heavily used Nazi Party imagery and an explicitly anti-monopoly political slogan. It was against the trust and the combine.
Let's clarify those terms for a second. When they say trust and combine, they are basically pointing fingers at the massive corporate monopolies and cartels of the era.
Precisely.
They are playing the populist card hard, telling the average struggling German worker, we are fighting the greedy megacorporations.
And what's fascinating here is the underlying psychology of how they leveraged the anxieties of that exact moment. Between 1930 and 1932, during the absolute worst depths of the economic crash, their advertisements frequently depicted catastrophic situations.
Really? Like what?
Like riots or economic ruin. They weren't selling glamour. They were using the very real economic terror people were feeling to sell advice.
Why does that work, though? I mean, if I'm terrified about losing my job or starving, why would seeing a catastrophe in the newspaper make me buy a cigarette?
Because nicotine is a stress reliever. And in a time of profound societal trauma, a cigarette is a tiny, affordable moment of relief.
Oh, wow. That is dark.
They were signaling to a desperate population, the world is collapsing, everything is terrible, but you can afford a 3 Pfennig moment of peace. And they tied that relief directly into military glorification. The SA promoted themselves as a military training program, essentially the successors to the banned Freikorps.
And for anyone unfamiliar, the Freikorps were these rogue, right-wing mercenary groups made up of angry World War I veterans that formed after Germany lost the war.
Exactly.
So the SA is tapping into that aggressive militaristic nostalgia. They sold these cigarettes with collectible sets of images featuring historical German military uniforms.
Like trading cards.
Right. They were making the prospect of serving in the army look incredibly appealing, tying patriotism and masculine duty directly to smoking their specific brand.
It was a brilliantly closed ecosystem of branding. You smoke our cheap brand to cope with the Depression, you collect our patriotic trading cards, you support the political movement.
But I have to stop you there because something in this narrative doesn't quite add up.
Okay, what's up?
If the marketing was so brilliant, if they had the airplanes, the sound trucks, the cool collectible cards, and the Trommler cigarettes, were literally the cheapest option available during a massive economic depression, why did they need to resort to physical violence to sell them?
That's a very good point.
I mean, if the product is that well positioned, it should sell itself, shouldn't it?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
But that is the crucial contradiction of the Sturm brand, and it reveals the dark, underlying reality of this entire operation. Because at the end of the day, they weren't relying on the free market. No. It was raw, mafia-style coercion. SA members weren't merely expected or encouraged to smoke Sturm cigarettes out of brand loyalty, they were violently compelled to.
The source actually notes that there were literal bag searches. If an SA member was caught with a rival brand of cigarettes in their pocket, they were formally fined by their own unit.
Exactly. And that coercion didn't stay internal. It spilled out into the streets, targeting the wider public and specifically the dominant market leader, this massive tobacco monopoly called Riemsma.
But the big guys.
The SA didn't just agitate with boycotts. SA men would organize and physically attack independent shops that dared to sell Riemsma brands.
Like actually attack them.
Oh, yeah. They smashed shop windows. They physically assaulted the shop workers who were just, trying to make a living.
So it's not a business success story at all. It's an extortion racket.
Completely.
They created a monopoly inside their own ranks through fines and bag searches, and they suppressed the outside competition through broken glass and physical beatings. And the terrifying part is it worked perfectly.
It really did.
This brutal combination of cheap products, psychological catastrophe marketing, and literal street violence brought in rivers of cash.
It did. And the immense scale of that newly acquired wealth completely transformed the SA while simultaneously creating a massive ideological contradiction at the very top of the German state.
Let's break down the math on this because we really need to understand the sheer windfall we are talking about here. At the time, a typical German smoker went through about 15 cigarettes a day.
Which is pretty standard.
Right. The source points out that's actually fairly similar to modern smoking rates. But the financial burden on the individual was entirely different. An average intensity Trommler smoker, making an average wage, would spend roughly a tenth of their gross income just on cigarettes.
Think about the psychological weight of that for a second. 10% of your pre-tax income.
That's massive.
And remember, this is the Great Depression. Unemployment had peaked at over 30%. Many of the people joining the SA didn't even have a regular wage. The militia actively recruited among the desperate, the unemployed, and the underemployed.
So what does this all mean? Imagine looking at your paycheck today, whatever it is, and taking a full 10% of it before rent, before groceries, and literally burning it on a coping mechanism.
It's unbelievable.
That is the level of addiction and brand loyalty we are talking about. And because the SA was getting a cut of 15 to 20 Pfennig for every 1,000 sold, the profits at the top were staggering.
Yeah, the source breaks it down nicely.
All right, it says 100 marks would be the earnings from 500,000 cigarettes. Because the typical SA unit represented just over 1,000 constant smokers, an average SA unit was suddenly pulling in hundreds of Reichsmarks every single month just for smoking.
By 1930, the firm was paying dividends directly to the SA. And by 1932, the annual turnover for the Sturm Cigarette Company was an eye-watering 36 million Reichsmarks.
36 million.
Yeah. To put that in a modern context, that's equivalent to roughly 148 million euros today.
Wow.
They used this massive influx of cash to buy new buildings, equip new factories, and fund even more aggressive advertising.
So we have an armed militia practically swimming in cigarette money, essentially running their own parallel economy. But here is the glaring hypocrisy in all of this. The leader of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, was famously rabidly anti-smoking.
Oh, he despised it.
He despised the habit. He even ordered localized smoking bans across the party.
And this is where we see a fundamental truth about how totalitarian states operate. If we connect this to the bigger picture, ideology almost always bows to state revenue.
Money talks.
Always. Hitler's localized bans, they were widely ignored. Why? Because the finance ministry absolutely loved the taxes that the tobacco industry brought in.
And it wasn't just pocket change either. The source notes that by 1941, tobacco taxes made up about a 1/12 of all state revenues.
A 12? That's a massive chunk of the budget.
You cannot run a government, let alone a war machine, if you suddenly cut off 8% of your total national income.
Furthermore, Aside from the taxes, the advertising revenues, and the royalties Sturm was pulling in, Nazi organizations were accepting millions of Reichsmarks in donations and straight-up bribes from the wider, traditional cigarette industry.
The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, ended up being the decisive voice on this, right?
He did.
He literally deemed cigarettes essential to the war effort.
Yeah.
The state viewed the addictive properties as a necessary tool for morale. They were so essential that cigarettes were distributed for free to soldiers as part of their regular pay.
Yeah, and that included miners who had been drafted into service.
Unbelievable. The result of all this state-sponsored top-down addiction. Between 1930 and 1940, the per capita cigarette consumption in Germany literally doubled, from 500 to 1,000 cigarettes a year. Tens of billions were being sold annually.
So you have this incredibly volatile environment. The SA is getting incredibly rich and powerful, operating almost as a state within a state, and causing massive economic disruption in the streets.
Right.
But the corporate giant they had been physically attacking Ramsma was not just going to sit back and watch their market share get beaten out of shopkeepers' hands.
Right. Because if you are Philip Ramsma, the CEO of this massive monopoly, you are losing money every single day to street thugs breaking your shop windows.
Yeah.
And you can't just call the police, because the street thugs are quickly becoming the state apparatus. So what is your next move?
You handle it the way massive corporations often handle existential threats. You buy your way out.
Exactly. And this leads directly to the ultimate corporate coup. It is June 1932. Philip Ramsma manages to secure a direct face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler, Rudolf Hess, and Max Amann.
Now, Amann is a crucial figure here.
Why is it?
He was Hitler's secretary and the head of the party's massive printing house. At this point, Ramsma's advertisements had been completely banned from Nazi Party publications by the SA.
Which was actually a massive tactical error by the SA, because that ad ban was bleeding the Nazi Party dry. The party's publications were losing a fortune without Ramsma's ad money, and the party desperately needed cash for their upcoming election campaigns.
Right. They needed that corporate money.
So in this meeting, Hitler initially scolds Ramsma for having Jewish partners, but the sheer desperate need for cash wins out instantly. They agree to an initial deal where Ramsma simply buys 500,000 marks worth of advertising space.
He literally just buys his way back into their good graces.
It's that simple.
But he knows that an ad buy isn't going to stop the SA from smashing his windows. So moving into 1933 and 1934, as the Nazis cement their power, Ramsma escalates his strategy. He goes straight over the SA's head to Hermann Goering, who is the highest official in Prussia at the time.
Okay, take it to the top.
Exactly. Ramsma asks Goering to do something about the SA's street violence and the various corruption charges the SA has drummed up against his company.
It is basically a high-stakes mafia protection racket. Ramsma is paying the mob boss to call off his ankle breakers.
That's exactly what it is.
And Goering's response is purely transactional. In early 1934, Goering magically calls off the court cases against Ramsma, the price for this state protection. A massive 3 million mark bribe.
3 million.
And it wasn't a one-time fee. Ramsma subsequently paid Goering an additional 1 million marks every single year, on top of making substantial ongoing donations to the party.
He essentially bought the protection of the state against the state's own paramilitary wing. And the timing of this corporate payoff perfectly aligns with one of the bloodiest political purges in history.
Here's where it gets really interesting and incredibly violent. In July 1934, the regime executes the infamous Night of the Long Knives. Hitler and Goering purged their own ranks, specifically wiping out the entire leadership of the SA. These were the very men who had built the Sturm cigarette company, the ones who had profited off the royalties, the ones who owned shares in the factories.
Gone.
In the span of a few days, they were suddenly either dead or imprisoned.
And with the old SA leadership entirely eliminated, the physical and economic threat to Ramsma evaporates overnight. The new, significantly weaker leader of the SA, Victor Lutzy, steps in.
And what happens?
Ramsma makes a few quiet inquiries, and almost immediately, Lutzy entirely cancels the Adar's manufacturing contract with Sturm cigarettes.
It is the ultimate cynical corporate irony.
Truly.
The SA, this once fearsome street militia that built a multi-million mark brand through broken windows, forced loyalty, and aggressive catastrophe marketing, strikes a new, sanitized deal with the very corporate giant they used to attack. The new SA leadership agrees to let Ramsma produce the SA's cigarettes in exchange for a fixed sum of 250,000 Reichsmarks paid annually. They went from being independent corporate raiders to being quiet, paid contractors for the monopoly.
Meanwhile, the Ziggurat firm Sturm is left with warehouses full of unsellable inventory. By 1935, the company that had effectively armed and funded a political movement quietly filed for bankruptcy.
Wow.
Corporate bribery and backroom deals had completely and utterly neutralized a paramilitary monopoly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, take a moment to really absorb the sheer whiplash of this historical arc. We watched a broke, desperate militia create a consumer brand from scratch to solve a cash flow problem.
Right.
We saw them use psychological manipulation, brute physical force, and extortion to enforce brand loyalty and rake in millions.
And
And then, at the absolute height of their power, we watched a massive corporate monopoly use exorbitant bribes to buy the favor of the regime's elite, ultimately crushing the militia's business empire and buying their market share back.
it's a lot to take in.
It is. The big takeaway for you here is to never, ever underestimate how deeply everyday consumer goods, something as simple, cheap, and disposable as a pack of cigarettes, can be entangled in the massive funding of radical political movements and the brutal reality of crony capitalism.
It is a stark reminder of how money, politics, and violence often balance on the exact same ledger.
Definitely.
And before we go, this raises an important question, one final, deeply complex tension from the source material that is worth pondering on your own.
Makes sense.
Consider the Remensma Company's Jewish partners and employees. The source explicitly notes that while Philip Remensma was actively funneling millions of marks in bribes to figures like Hitler and Goering to secure a corporate monopoly, the company was simultaneously using its vast resources to help its Jewish partners and many Jewish employees emigrate safely out of Germany.
Wait, really?
Yes. So how do we even begin to reconcile that mechanism? A corporation effectively funding a totalitarian regime's elite, ensuring the regime's financial survival, while simultaneously using that exact same corporate power to rescue its own people from the terror of that very same regime.
Wow. It is a profound, almost paralyzing contradiction. And, it is exactly the kind of messy, uncomfortable reality that makes history so vital to study.
I couldn't agree more.
Thank you for taking the deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the unseen stories behind the everyday items you see on the shelves, and we'll catch you on the next one.